Nature is an infinite number of precarious balancing acts. Even small amounts of toxic chemicals threaten life as we know it. While studying seagull nesting areas on California's Channel Islands, Dr. George Hunt realized the nest contained almost double the normal number of eggs. The doctor posed a grim question. Are the pollutants in the water disrupting the intrinsic balance of life? Are these toxins, he asked, threatening one of the most vital mechanisms controlling homeostasis in humans and other vertebrates? The endocrine system.
These various chemicals that are apparently affecting the endocrine systems of birds and maybe other organisms have their effects because they mimic various hormones so that the organism will either develop abnormally or will have behavioral modifications that are the result of the pesticide acting as if it were a hormone in the wrong place at the wrong time.
After discovering super-large clutches of California gull eggs, Dr. Hunt returned annually to Santa Barbara Island. He initially suspected these largely infertile batches would exhibit the same pesticide-induced deficiencies scientists had seen in pelicans and cormorants.
When we examined the pesticide levels in these eggs, we did find moderately elevated levels, but not anywhere near as high as the pelicans had had. We then started looking for the potential cause of the supernormal clutches, and our surprise was that we found, in many cases, 2 females incubating eggs on the same nest and no male associated with that nest.
In fact, Hunt found fewer birds exhibiting male behaviors in the population as a whole. This caught the attention of endocrinology researcher Dr. Michael Fry.
When George found that there were very few males in the population, then I thought that this was a great possibility that the estrogenic effects of DDT were actually just sterilizing the males in the egg.
Fry's speculation centered around the fact that man-made chemicals like DDT function much like natural hormones. In humans and in all vertebrates, these hormones are secreted by a collection of glands known as the endocrine system. Some of these glands, such as the anterior pituitary gland, release hormones directly into the bloodstream. Their primary purpose is to activate other glands within the endocrine system. The thyroid, pancreas, and adrenal glands secrete hormones that signal changes in other organs and tissues. The reproductive glands, or gonads, ovaries in females, testes in males, secrete hormones such as estrogen and testosterone. Estrogen and testosterone control the growth and development of the reproductive system. Dr. Fry believed the hormones that control the normal development pattern in the gulls had been disrupted.
When you have an estrogenic hormone or an estrogenic pollutant in a male embryo, it causes testicular feminization. It causes the retention of the oviducts, and male birds exposed to estrogens in the egg or shortly after hatching don't exhibit any breeding behavior, so that these birds are really chemically neutered.
And although we don't know whether these males survive or whether they just fail to come to the colonies, this was at least a clue as to why we might have an excess of females on the colonies and very few males in attendance.
We've got quite a few compounds in this sample. Do you know what
To understand how pesticides impair animal reproduction, Dr. Fry looked at the chemical nature of hormones within the endocrine system.
To coordinate its complex interactions, the body produces a variety of signaling molecules. Some work in the cell that produces them. Others affect neighboring cells. A select few receive the official title of hormone by being produced in an endocrine gland, entering the bloodstream, and affecting target cells a distance away. Which cells a hormone or other signaling molecule targets is determined by the presence of receptor molecules in or on the target cell. Each signaling molecule has a specific shape that will only fit into a matching shaped receptor. An exact lock and key type fit is needed to elicit a full response. The hundreds of different shaped signals and receptors in the body provides DDT and other harmful chemicals a limitless number of targets, limitless ways to alter homeostasis.
We find that environmental toxins can bind directly to the receptor and activate that receptor. They would stimulate the receptor and act just like the regular hormone. Similarly, we can have hormone antagonists, which would bind to the receptor and then block the activity of the normal hormone binding to it. So it would be anti-estrogenic. They would suppress the activity of the estrogen receptor. And we have examples of both kinds of pollutants, and there are a lot of pharmaceutical drugs also that act in these ways.
But environmental toxins are found at such low concentrations, scientists questioned whether they could actually be responsible for the changes.
The nature of the evolution of hormones has been such that the hormone receptors are extremely sensitive. The levels of circulating hormones, estrogens or androgens, they're found at parts per billion or even parts per trillion as the active amounts in our bodies. So that it takes very little of an equally active compound to disrupt hormone activity.
Some of the metabolites are probably...
It's interesting that some of these look to be pretty thin because
Fry sought to test the probability of his hypothesis by experimenting with eggs collected from a relatively pollution-free area.
we took unexposed eggs, about 300 gull egg from clean colonies, brought them into the laboratory, and did a series of egg injections and looked at the abnormalities that we found in the embryos as they developed. What we found was that at the same levels of DDT contamination that were present in the wild, we got testicular feminization of a substantial magnitude, indicating that the male chicks that would hatch from these eggs would essentially be chemically neutered or chemically sterilized.
Alarmingly, many problems are reproductive in nature. The male chicks have no ability or desire to breed. The problem may be due to the fat-soluble nature of reproductive hormones. This allows them to enter body membranes more freely than water-soluble hormones that are amino acid or protein-based.
With steroid hormones, they are lipid-soluble and they make it through the cell membranes. The peptide, the protein hormones, are much bigger and they bind to specific receptors on the outside of the cell.
Fortunately, environmental cleanup efforts have improved living conditions for the California gull. Their clutch size is returning to normal. Unfortunately, the overwhelming number of signaling molecules and the equally daunting number of potential pollutants may be cause for concern in the human food chain.
We could possibly have abnormalities in humans. So that I very much view environmental toxicology of this kind as early warnings to what is going on.
How toxic chemicals affect the endocrine system is a warning signal that deserves our attention. They disturb the equilibrium humans and other vertebrates require to mature and reproduce. And chemicals are just one source of stress in our modern world. An organism's survival depends upon its ability to respond appropriately to stresses caused by changes in its environment. Those responses must be coordinated by the body's two controlling systems, the nervous system and the endocrine system.
The nervous system and the endocrine systems are separate anatomical entities that can function quite independently of each other. However, they also talk to each other through common molecules, common receptors, common chemical signals. So while they both act independently, they also coordinate their action to provide a good response to threats to homeostasis.
The best-known neuroendocrine response to stress is the fight or flight response, a response triggered by a serious, perhaps deadly threat. In these instances, the nervous system stimulates a variety of responses, including the release of the hormone epinephrine, also called adrenaline.
Our defense mechanisms were developed when we lived in a very harsh environment, while we had to search for our food, fight wild beasts. And so those defense mechanisms evolved at that time. They are obviously not all necessarily well adjusted to our life presently, which encounters a lot more emotional and psychological stresses than physical stresses.
But as patient Diane Pestalacci found out, even psychological stress can cause very real physical responses. She went to Dr. Jeffrey Wilson's biofeedback clinic to learn to recognize those stress responses.
Not really pulling them down, but allowing them just to be loosely attach your arms and shoulders.
I learned through Dr. Wilson to identify some of the physiological changes that I was going through in response to stress that I didn't recognize, that I had thought were normal, and I hadn't realized that before. And that although I'd always had cold hands, that not everybody always has cold hands, and that may too be a part of the way that my body responded to stress.
The blood goes away from the hands and the feet and actually the surface of the skin, because if we happen to get damaged, cut, or injured during some kind of a fighting or fleeing, we won't bleed as much. And so there's theory that all of these are evolutionarily beneficial to protect the organism. And just let them fall. Right.
But muscle tension and an over-responsive fight or flight reaction could not sufficiently explain all of the symptoms Diane experienced.
Just letting the shoulders fall.
I've had an autoimmune condition where your body apparently makes antibodies to your hair follicles, and your hair follicles go dormant for some period of time. The last time that I had it, prior to this episode, I actually lost 85% of the hair on my body, where I ended up having to wear a wig for 1.5 years.
The mind-body connection is a very important one, and it was part of the folklore for a long time and wasn't taken too seriously by many people. But now we know that it is a reality, and we have the scientific basis to study it. The mind-body connection is a molecular connection.
Researchers like Dr. Riviere work to clarify the relationship between the mind and the body's immune system. They have found such a link by way of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland.
The hypothalamus is a small structure, and it contains cells that produce hormones. These hormones travel to the pituitary.
The pituitary gland is actually two separate glands, both controlled by the hypothalamus. Some hormones produced in the hypothalamus are transported down neurons to the posterior pituitary, where they are stored. There, nerve impulses trigger their release into the blood. This storage is important for hormones like vasopressin that must be released in large amounts in emergency situations, such as severe blood loss. The anterior pituitary, on the other hand, produces its own hormones. Here, the hypothalamus regulates hormonal production by either sending inhibiting or releasing factors to the gland. In response, the anterior pituitary secretes varying amounts of its hormones into the general blood circulation. These hormones, in turn, control other glands and metabolic reactions of cells all over the body.
The anterior pituitary's control of other endocrine glands suggests it's the master gland. The stress response Dr. Riviere studies is one example of such dominance. Whether in times of stress or under normal conditions, a releasing factor from the hypothalamus stimulates the pituitary to make the hormone ACTH, which in turn stimulates the adrenal gland to produce corticosteroids, hormones that affect the metabolism, the immune system, and change the way other hormones react. During stress, this output is increased.
The main endocrine reaction to stress is the release of corticosteroids, which are essential in order to tap our stored resources on a short-term basis. They're also very important to maintain the tone of our blood vessels. But during long-term release of corticosteroids, they start to become harmful to the body. For example, they will inhibit the immune system. And so if an organism is exposed to stress for a very long time, the immune cells will be shut down.
Normally, a process known as negative feedback prevents excessive hormone production. The corticosteroids feed back to the hypothalamus and pituitary, which respond by decreasing ACTH. This in turn drops corticosteroid production to normal levels. But prolonged stress decreases sensitivity of the hypothalamus and pituitary to this feedback, allowing hormone levels to increase. Through biofeedback, those who suffer from stress can learn to control this response.
As I like to say, it is all in your brain. So if you can exert a control over how you perceive stress, you can then influence your hypothalamic activity and prevent it in particular from overshooting.
One of the things we learned going through biofeedback is to be aware of our reactions so that we can catch them earlier.
What it's helped me to do on a day-to-day basis, again, is to identify the stressful situation and to intervene before I get a very heightened level of stress, to intervene when the stress is still controllable and manageable, just by recognizing this is something that typically would set me off into this real negative cycle of stress.
Thanks to research conducted by Dr. Riviere and others, we are beginning to understand normal neural and endocrine interactions. Working with this information, researchers are now devising treatments that utilize medication and behavioral techniques to maintain homeostasis, even in the face of severe stress. But as we now realize, stress isn't the only factor that threatens the endocrine system's delicate balance.
Go traffic and weather together, and taking a look at those roads, we've come up to speed after really a kind of a horrendous commute. Now, San Diego weather.
It's currently 68 at Lindbergh Field, 67 in the East County, and it's 65 at Oceanside. Some early morning drizzle, and then mostly sunny Friday. Beach highs around 71.
We take many routine events for granted, assuming that if we eat right and exercise regularly, we'll stay healthy. But for some people, like radio commentator Pat Gallagher, it's not that easy.
Jan Goldsmith announces state hearings on Medi-Cal fraud.
A deficiency in his endocrine system makes each new day a challenging balancing act.
Morning drizzle, and then mostly sunny on Friday. Beach.
But in my instance, my mother was type 1 diabetic. She passed away from diabetes complications about 6 years ago. I have type 1 diabetes, and so does my daughter. And so we have 3 straight generations of diabetes.
Diabetes, by definition, is hyperglycemia, which means high circulating glucose concentrations. There are 2 major types of diabetes. The first is called the insulin-dependent diabetes, or type 1, and the second is non-insulin dependent diabetes, or type 2.
Insulin is the hormone responsible for moving glucose from the blood into cells. This is especially true for muscle cells, which use a lot of glucose, and fat and liver cells, which store it.
There's no question that the most important hormone in the regulation of glucose homeostasis is insulin, and insulin, period. The regulation of glucose homeostasis is complex. The primary purpose of insulin is to move glucose out of the circulation and into the tissues of the body. And the reason is simple. Glucose is the primary energy source for metabolism of every cell in the body.
Insulin and many other products are made in a gland called the pancreas. Most pancreatic tissue is exocrine in nature, meaning it secretes its products onto a body surface. Like islands floating in a foreign sea, the endocrine portion of the pancreas, including beta cells, composes only 2% of the gland.
In the human, there could be as many as 1 million of these islands distributed throughout the pancreas, and each one contains 2,000 to 3,000 endocrine cells. And under appropriate conditions, the cells in the islet will release these hormones into the extracellular space, where they'll be picked up by the circulatory system and transported to the body, where they can work on particular target cells. Glucose will not penetrate the cell membrane of any cell in the body unless it is transported in response to insulin stimulation.
The amount of insulin required depends on a variety of factors. One factor is how much glucose a person eats. Another is how much glucose a person burns. The normal body constantly monitors blood glucose and uses a feedback process to precisely regulate insulin secretion to match the body's changing needs.
After a meal, the concentration of glucose will increase in the blood. And the beta cells in the pancreas can sense that increase and will respond in a corresponding way by secreting insulin. Insulin will bind with high affinity to the insulin receptor, and then will facilitate the transport of glucose out of the blood and into the cell. And the end result then is a decrease in the circulating concentration of glucose.
So the stimulus, high glucose, causes a response, insulin secretion, that feeds back to lower the high blood glucose. This removes the original stimulus. However, in Pat Gallagher and his daughter Courtney, this feedback loop has been disrupted by the destruction of the insulin-producing beta cells in the pancreas. As a result, Pat and Courtney must artificially monitor their blood sugar levels and regulate them by injecting synthetic human insulin.
Ooh, see, I'm a little bit high. I really work hard on controlling the blood sugars. I test my blood 7 to 8 times a day, and I use what's called an insulin pump, which is a little microcomputer that just constantly feeds insulin to my body all the time. Your body produces 1,000 little shots a day of insulin. If you're trying to duplicate on 2 or 3 shots a day, it just doesn't work, especially if you have a hectic lifestyle. The insulin pump every 15 minutes administers insulin, and you can vary it with the computer at various times of the day, because your body changes overnight, or during the afternoon or at nighttime.
Pat and Courtney perform a daily high wire act to prevent a malfunction in their insulin mechanism. Falling off the high wire could be dangerous, even fatal.
If you can't move glucose from the circulation into the cell does not have glucose available for oxidative metabolism. They cannot generate energy from glucose. In response to a perceived absence of glucose, the body then begins to mobilize fatty acids for energy consumption. In the case of diabetes, it's primarily LDL, or low-density lipoprotein, would tend to support the development of arteriosclerosis and plaque formation in the coronary arteries and in the brain. The glucose levels put into effect additional changes that then can lead to some very, very serious complications.
This is Living with Diabetes.
Because of his family's past and present struggles, Gallagher uses his radio and television shows to enlighten and educate people about diabetes. He hopes to pass on his desire to live a normal life to others, especially to Courtney.
She's a bright kid. I mean, she's really gonna do well. And I think that the diabetes will play a small factor. And that's what I give to Courtney, is that you can do whatever you want, and don't let anybody tell you you can't.
The endocrine system is one of the main instruments of homeostatic regulation in animals. It helps balance inputs and outputs. It helps maintain the equilibrium between internal and external environments. And it influences how humans and other vertebrates grow, develop, and reproduce. Functioning properly, the endocrine system continuously makes precise but subtle hormonal adjustments throughout the body, thus assuring the vital process of life.